let's get started then. So first of all, I'm going to hand over to our lovely Sally and Barry, who are going to talk about the internal funding process in England and Wales. And then also David is going to join to talk about the process in Scotland. So Sally, over to you.
Thanks, Michelle. Right, so first of all, we're just going to run through what the criteria is in order to have a case with Together that will fit within our internal funding process. So there are a few requirements that your case must fit within. And Michelle mentioned some recent changes that we've made to this process. So the first one is quite fortuitous that we're running this call to talk about, is that we've recently increased the loan amount up to £500,000. So for any loan up to £500,000 that meets the rest of this criteria, it goes in our internal funding. It's for remortgage and capital raises only, so for fairly straightforward transactions. So we've put no transfers of equity within that. It's also not available on purchase transactions. It's where we are lending to individual clients, and the property can be a residential property, semi-commercial and commercial property if it is within England and Wales. But for properties in Scotland, the internal funding process is for residential properties only. And that also excludes holiday lets. And when we talk about the Scottish process, I think David will maybe go through that in more detail as to the reason why.
Yep.
So the process from as I would be dealing with you as BDM, from a broker packager perspective, is that what you'll find is when you're keying the case onto My Broker Venue and it fits within that criteria that was detailed on the previous slide, it automatically falls into this internal funding criteria, and it will therefore produce you with two additional documents for England and Wales transactions, and that is a loan agreement and a legal charge that you need to print off with the rest of the requirements, for instance, the mortgage application and the TT form. And you send the loan agreement and the legal charge to your client for their signature. And then when you're packaging the case to send it back to Together, those two additional documents then need to be provided to us. And aside from that, from putting a case together for Together, lots of those, there's no further action required on your part as the broker and packager. If it falls into that criteria, it automatically for us falls into the process. So Barry, do you want to talk a little bit more about what the process is when the case gets there, and maybe there's an particular importance that we do see it together? But I will raise that when we get these additional documents, it's very important that they are clear, scanned copies and not photographs.
Yes, thanks, Sally. The process, to be honest, has been running for many years, and it was embedded in that time. And a lot of the brokers who may be on the call now are aware of it, and some won't be. The process, we get the documentation through from the underwriting teams at a very early stage in the application. It's usually the same day they've made a decision as to whether the case is to proceed or not. And what we do is we'll operate a two-stage overall process. The initial stage is as fast as we can. On the same day we get the request, we'll review the titles, update all the searches, that type of thing, and we'll put a full note on the case so that underwriters and the brokers can be fully aware of if there are any things that may prevent it proceeding quickly and how to alleviate them, or if none at all, then it's good to go as far as we're concerned at that stage. The case then moves back to underwriting, and we may never see it again. We may see it the next day, or however, whenever that may be. Again, when the case comes back to fund, hopefully with all the documentation complete, things like valuations, whatever else has been asked for, as during the underwriting process, as a full case. We'll then review it again the same day when it comes back, and subject to that all being in the right order and correct, then the case can be funded the same day. As Sally says, we do need proper scanned documentation. That's not a necessity that we set, it's one that the Land Registry set, and we have to make sure that all documents that we have, particularly the legal charge, is from an original scan, a scan of the original. We do have a few issues occasionally with certain things like consents that come in from certain areas and certain brokers that don't match the requirements of Land Registry. Again, it's unfortunate, but we have to keep pushing those back until we get them exactly as they are. Again, it's not something we set, it's something that the registry sets. But in terms of the overall process, we keep it simple. It's reviewed the same day at the pre-stage, and it's reviewed the same day at the funding stage. And hopefully, if everything's in line, that's as much involvement as we have.
I think the scanned piece is really important because we see a lot of cases where we get the pushback on scanned documents. Why is it not acceptable? So the implication for us, correct me if I'm wrong, Barry, is that we can't then register our charge if the HMLR don't accept the documents in the format for which they're produced.
Yes, I mean, quality of document is one thing. The other side, as well as the overall quality, we need to know the full details of witnesses because they require this. But the document has to be taken from an original. The scan's got to be from an original document. That's something that we make a declaration to the registry on every single application that we submit for registration that we've got. So if they ever audited and found that that wasn't the case and we weren't making sure, we would have to discuss why, and that could be an issue that we'd have that we don't really want. So that's the main reason.
Right, so David and I are going to hotfoot this slide between us, I think. So David, it might be worthwhile you interjecting rather than me list what the packaging requirements are. So the first part, really, if you've got a case where the property is in Scotland rather than in England or Wales, is the first step that you'll do as a broker packager is contact Wilson McKendrick to request the two salient documents, and that is a copy of the title search and a copy of the standard security document. David, are you happy to explain what those documents are and the purpose of them both?
So the first thing is, when you do the request, if you're not an existing broker, we'll have to take you on as a client so we can do the search and prepare the security. So we're doing your wee pack with an SLA, which you'll have to respond to. So if you're not an existing broker of this company, that'll have to go done first. The property search is just a search detailing who the owners are, when they purchased the property, and a list of any existing charges over the property. If there's any issues with the search, likes of inhibition, sequestration, or anything of that nature, it will go through as an unclear search. But we will put in guidance as regards what the issue is and what you've got to do to resolve the issue as a broker. So the typical ones that we have problems on in Scotland is as follows. So in Scotland we've got two systems of land registration. We've got a CZine register, we've got a land register. The land register is based on the English system of registration. If the property happens to be situated in the CZine register, it's got to be moved across to the land register. That means the borrower will have to instruct his or her own solicitor to do that process. It's what's known as a voluntary application. So that can sometimes cause a delay. The other issues that are sort of like unique to Scotland would be a debt arrangement scheme. That's similar to a trust deed in England, but what that does, it puts a bar on the borrower borrowing any additional money without the consent of the AIB, the accountants in bankruptcy. Sometimes that's an issue. You don't really see that in England because a debt arrangement scheme doesn't exist in England. The other thing you sometimes see up here is an inhibition. An inhibition is similar to your CCJ. That prevents you from taking out a loan unless it's repaid within the first 5 years of inhibition. So there's a multitude of issues that can sometimes arise in the search, but the search you do get back from us will tell you what the issue is, and it will also explain what you've got to do to resolve it. We're also available here to answer any queries if you don't understand any of the issues or you've got a problem trying to resolve the actual query. The standard security is the same as equivalent to your charge in England. We'll send you the standard security along with the search at the same time. You've just got to make sure you inform us whether it's going to be a together personal loan, whether it's going to be a together commercial loan, because we've got two different standard securities, and that is something that we find there's a problem is that once we get the clearance to clear the case, sometimes it's discovered you've got the wrong security, the wrong charge. So it's important that is identified and you tell us which one to instruct at the actual start. The stand security, the original, we've got to hold the original stand security, so it's got to be sent to us, and once that comes in, we then notify together. But I think I might be skipping ahead in that one.
No, that's fine. No, thank you. So yeah, once you've got the title search and the standard security, as David said, if there's anything noted on there, you're going to have access to those documents. But it's the same theory really as the England and Wales process, that whereas you're sending us the land registry and loan agreement and legal charge for that, for this you'll be sending us a copy of the title search and a copy of the standard security document. So you package it as normal, sending us the scanned copies of those documents, and then the original hard copy of the completed and signed standard security must be returned to Wilson McKendrick. I believe a copy of these slides are going to be available afterwards, so it's a good note point for the process to make sure that you are following that for the original to go back to them. And Wilson McKendrick will send us a copy of this for our records afterwards. And when it's ready for completion, together request the certificate to proceed. And that ensures that there's no changes from the original search report. I don't know if there's anything you want to add on that, David, for why the
what we do is we update the search. Hopefully, it will be clear. If something has occurred in between the date of the original search and that date, again, we'll notify together and we'll say what's got to be done to resolve it. At that stage, it might come across maybe an inhibition, or that would be the type of thing you might have got, or they might have taken out a further charge of the property. That thing would be highlighted in that data search, but that's why we do that data search.
Yeah.
And then after that, you're then clear to pair the case.
Yeah, and we've also popped the cost of these documents noted on here as well. So the £50 originally, and then £25 plus VAT for the certificate to proceed, because it's just something for yourselves as brokers and packages to be aware of, to be informing the clients.
And the reason why we can't do holiday lets is because in Scotland you need a short-term let license, and as well as a short-term let license, you also need planning permission. Now in Scotland, what they did was they set up, the local authorities can set up control areas where planning permission is compulsory. Currently, you've only got 2 areas in Scotland where that's the case. It's Edinburgh and the Highlands. So people thought at that time that it was only in those 2 areas you needed planning permission, but that's not the case. The Scottish Government released guidelines to state that planning permission is at the discretion of each local authority, and each local authority has got to decide on a case-by-case basis whether planning permission is required for change of use to use as a short-term holiday let. It's very difficult. So that means that every single short-term let case, somebody's got to contact the planning department, the local authority, to see whether or not planning permission is required. And if it's not required, we need confirmation of that. If it is required, you've also got to get planning permission approval.
Okay, so there's a lot more legal work involved.
It's not clear up here at all. It's really not clear. And what makes it worse is that the department that deals with short-term let licenses will tell you they don't need anything else. But of course, that department is separate from the planning department.
Yeah.
A bit like HMOs in England. Now, the HMO planning is different from the HMO license.
And the internal funding process is designed to be straightforward and speedy. So when you've got something like that falls outside, it becomes a more complicated transaction.
Yeah, it's just a fast track process.
Yeah,
it's not suited for anything of any type of complication or anything, because we just don't check the planning. We don't check the short-term let licenses. All we're relying is that there's a clear title sheet. There's no issues. we're taking the property, taking the security over the whole property in the title sheet.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So now we're going to move over to Tim, and Tim's going to go through how you can help speed up the legal process. So, Tim, over to you.
Thanks very much, Michelle. So we just put a slide together for a number of points that probably seem pretty obvious and straightforward, but I think sometimes you just need to go through the basics and just talk through them. So first one is about who is acting for the borrowers. So whenever priority law are dealing with a transaction that's in legals, we'll always have us representing together, and then the borrower's got their own solicitor, and obviously they can choose whoever they want to act for them. And we deal with everything from a sort of one-man band on Aberystwyth High Street all the way up to like the biggest magic circle international firms and everything that's in between. And on at any one time, we're dealing with literally thousands of different solicitors, and there's not that many people anymore that haven't dealt with us and don't know our process, but you get a very wide range of performance, if you like, from these solicitors. So for example, if they're going to a little high street conveyancing practice that isn't familiar with bridging lending and is used to doing sort of slow and steady conveyancing transactions, then it's going to be slower than if you go to a firm that is specialized in it. So you need to find someone who is used to working at speed, preferably that's got experience of doing bridging lending. Even better if they've got experience of working with priority law and together, because most people have these days, and they will know the documents, they will know our inquiries. You know, I helped rewrite our inquiries shortly after I joined a decade ago, and whilst we tweak them from time to time, they're largely unchanged. So, you know, basically anyone who's dealt with us for the last 10 years will know our process. The documentation has changed a bit, but again, it's pretty standard. So someone who's familiar with our requirements is brilliant. We often have brokers who, I don't think I'm giving any secrets away, but they often will deal with a very small number of solicitors themselves, and they will say to their borrowers, which they're allowed to do, you know, here's half a dozen people who we know really well that work really well with priority law and know the together stuff inside out, and, you know, use whoever you want, but if you use one of these people, they'll do you at a good price, and you know you're going to get a good service out of them. And that may be a sort of self-employed type person working for one of the kind of umbrella firms like Gunnar Cook and Keystone and Excello, where they're kind of incentivized because they're working on their own as opposed to for a big firm. Or it could just be a firm that's good at doing what we need them to do. And I had an example this morning where on a completed transaction, the solicitor sent me a requisition that they'd got from Land Registry, and he couldn't work out how to register the charge. And it turned out he was trying to register the loan agreement at Land Registry. And so without, you know, any disrespect to that guy, like, he shouldn't really be doing this deal. And it was hard work, you know, trying to get it funded. So and we see, in terms of speed, we see deals that go from start to finish in a couple of days. I completed one today on a £500,000 transaction that I got instructed on last night, and that's with separate representation, full replies to inquiries, full documents being signed, PGs, debentures, sole certs, all of it. And yet I've got a load of files where I've written to solicitors 3 weeks ago and I'm not even had an acknowledgement. So solicitors really important. Yeah, so keeping in touch with us, unlike a lot of solicitors, we are very happy to talk to everybody that's involved in the transaction, particularly the brokers. We think the relationship that we've got with brokers is incredibly important, and we are more than happy for you to be copied in to the extent that you want to on all emails, or kept updated, or ask us for updates. You can phone us for updates, you can email us. We have a portal that you should have access to where you can track cases if you want to do that. But, you know, equally, you can always just pick up the phone. If you don't know who's dealing with a transaction, you can always speak to me or one of the other partners. We have as well an email address that's probably worth making quick notes. Very easy to remember. It's updates with an S on the end at prioritylaw.co.uk. So if you know that you've got a transaction that is in legals and we're instructed on it, but you don't know who's dealing with it or where it's up to, you can email that email address. It's valid for everybody, internal and external. And as various people will be able to profess to, we respond to that incredibly quickly, and it goes to the whole fee earning team in priority law, and you will get a response saying, yeah, this person's dealing with it, they'll come back to you, they'll give you an update, or it may be that we can't find it and it turns out it's dual rep or it's Scottish or whatever, but you'll get an answer as to where we're up to with the transaction if we're dealing with it. And we'll always be very transparent. We like to provide a insanely quick level of service. For all intents and purposes, we have one client, and it's a client that keeps us extremely busy, doing hundreds of millions of pounds of completions a month, billions of pounds a year. And so we have to provide them with a very good service, because otherwise we won't get the work anymore. And new brokers are a very big part of that. So we don't ever want to be the cause of any delays. We have a same day, 24-hour turnaround on all correspondence, unless it's some sort of like 10,000 document data room. It might take a bit longer. So we should be dealing with stuff same day, next day, and depending on timing. So we don't ever want to be the cause of any delays. But if there's ever any issues, you can obviously raise those with us. And also, if you come to us direct, it makes people's lives a lot easier, because if, for example, you go to whoever it may be, Sally or whoever your contact is, and they've got to get the update, and we've got to update them, and they've got to update you, and then you've got queries, and it sort of goes round in circles. We're happy to do that, but we will talk to you direct if you want to do that, and you can email and phone us at any time. I just saw that someone put a note in the chat box, I think, asking for the email address. So we'll put a note in there afterwards, and happy to circulate it later, Michelle, and give my contact details to anyone who wants them as well.
Thank you.
Okay, so security documents. This is a big one. It's, bear in mind, I've been doing this for 10 years with largely the same documents. It is very unusual that you get a set of documents that's correctly executed, and that to me seems absolutely insane. But there's usually something. Now, whether it's board minutes that don't have the place of the meeting written on, or the date of the meeting, or a loan agreement that comes back without a date on it, or a charge that comes back without the witness details, like what Barry said earlier, it's very basic stuff, but it slows things down, especially if, for example, the borrower signs the documents and then posts them to the solicitor, and they go missing for a few days or whatever, and we're trying to complete a deal, but we need the originals to be with the solicitor with amendments done. It's not rocket science, but you get the documents day one, and so they should be signed promptly, which doesn't mean a month later. It means if you've got the documents, subject to the solicitor being happy that they're correct and whatever, the borrower needs to get in and sign them if he's going to meet physically with them in person. And if he's not, he needs to sign those documents and get them in the post so that the originals are with the solicitor. We don't need the originals to complete, but we need them to be with the borrower's solicitor. So there's no reason why they shouldn't be signing those early days. And there's some situations where we'll go through a transaction for maybe a week or so, and then we'll have everything ready to go, and we'll even sometimes report together, but we're waiting for the signed documents because the borrower's just not been in to sign. So the first thing that we do when brokers call us to ask for updates on things is we've got no signed documents, we might have some replies or not. So have you spoken to the borrower? Have they met with the solicitor? Have they signed the documents and posted them? And again, we have brokers who are very hands-off, and that's fine. They just sort of leave us to it and hope for the best. And we have brokers who are incredibly hands-on. And I've even got one who literally puts a solicitor in a taxi to the borrower on every deal to make sure that those documents get signed promptly and correctly. So yeah, it's really important. It's basic stuff, but get the documents signed quickly and correctly, and it makes everyone's lives a lot easier. So valuation, we see less of this these days, but it still happens where we'll report on a transaction and the valuation is not in yet, or it's expired, and we need to rely on, or it's so old and it's been extended before that we need to get a new valuation. And that's really frustrating for us, because we're obviously going a million miles an hour trying to get everything done as quickly as possible, and then there's no valuation. So just if you can please help by, I'm sure that Together are doing this internally as well and keeping an eye on valuers and what they're doing and panels and stuff, but if you can just make sure that you know where it's up to, because we don't get involved in various things like valuations, and I think I'll mention it later, but buildings insurance and EPCs, there's all sorts of things that as brokers, you do and together need, but we don't get involved in that. So if you can make sure that the valuation's on track, that we know when it's going to land, and then we can try and make sure it's aligned, and we're not kind of doing the legals and then be like, oh, where's the val, or he's not paid for the valuation, we sometimes get, and all this bonkers stuff. So complicated deals, we see a real wide range of transactions at Priority Law, going from £50,000 second charges all the way up to £20 million huge big development facilities and everything in between. If you've ever got something that's a bit quirky, and I've given some examples there, offshore borrowers, we're going to need offshore opinions for them. So it might be the British Virgin Islands, it might be America. We see all sorts of different stuff. If you know that you've got an offshore borrower, make sure that that's made clear on the application and when you're submitting it, and that you are aware of the things that we'll need, whether that's structure forms and charts and things that together we'll have for you to fill in, or whether that's just discussing with us what our offshore opinion requirements are. Same with trusts and pension funds. We're going to need to know all the details of the trustees and the beneficiaries, and have ID and proof of residence for them, and all of these things that we have to do. So the sooner we know about those, the better, because what we don't want to do is just sort of issue something and then find out 2 weeks later when the borrower's solicitor replied to us, actually, this is, it's an offshore company, or it's a pension fund, or this, that, and the other, and no one's done anything. There's no reason why you can't kind of, as part of the packaging process, deal with that. Similarly, bankruptcy, I've got a deal at the moment where it was like perfectly good to go. But when we got the bankruptcy search, there was a pending action. And we're like, well, what's going on? Like, oh yeah, he's got a bankruptcy petition that's in listed for a month's time. We're like, right, well, we can't give the money whilst that's pending. So we do have a mechanism whereby we can pay off that petition if it's obviously subject to underwriter approval. And sometimes that's what our loans are used for. And it might be just a cash flow issue. But I don't want to be finding out about that when we're ready to complete, because no one discloses it. Like, if you know that the money is being used to pay off a pending winding up petition or a bankruptcy petition, then tell us, and we can discuss with you what the process is and how we can make that run smoothly. I had one last week where, again, we did the transaction, we reported, we were ready to go, we did the winding up search on the day of completion, which is the appropriate time to do it. We don't do them beforehand. And there was a pending petition, and they're like, oh yeah, it's just HMRC, it's a couple $100,000, we're disputing it. I'm like, right, well, we can't lend to you with that in place. So if you know about any of those things, then tell us. It's worth maybe asking to be, as part of your process, to find out if there's any such things, because the borrower won't necessarily tell you either. So I touched on this before, but we often get sort of last minute delays because we're waiting for a consent from another lender or a redemption statement, and these aren't things that we get involved with. It's something that the borrower's solicitor and or the broker is responsible for arranging. We can't go to other lenders and ask them for redemption statements and consents, even if we wanted to. So if you know that you're doing a second charge and you need a consent from Barclays or Lloyds or Coots or whoever it may be, make sure you're getting that request in, because again, sometimes they come back, like Barry was touched on earlier, they sometimes come back with the wrong name. Like, we might get a consent, it says Together Personal Finance. That's no use to us if we're doing a Together Commercial Finance deal, and it's got to have the title number on, and if it's a redemption statement, it's got to be clear that it's for that account. Sometimes you get things like business loans with where you've got break costs and all sorts of unusual elements to them, and we need to know about those sooner rather than later, so that we can make sure that we've do all the what we need to do. Similarly, buildings insurance, EPCs, financial statements, accountants references, all of these things, they often will pop up at the very last minute and we'll be ready to go, and then the Together guys will have to go to the broker and be like, we've still not got the EPC, we've still not got the financial statements and all these things. So if you could just do your bit and make sure that we'll sort the legals, you sort all these other things, and just make sure that the valuation and all of these bits and pieces of paper that you've got to get are in there. Balance funds, we're seeing more and more of this recently, with whether it's parents gifting deposits, which has been around for a while, but we see a lot, in particular in certain communities, we see a lot of brothers and sisters and cousins and aunts and uncles giving gifts, often very big ones. And depending on the amount of money that we're talking about and what the relationships are, that may or may not be a red flag. So if, for example, it's mum and dad gifting £10,000 to the son to buy the first property, we're going to be pretty relaxed about that. We'll still need an indemnity policy because that's what we need to do to protect everyone. But we won't necessarily make them go out and sign a statutory declaration and all the rest of it, because that's more cost and more delay. But if we've got someone's uncle giving them £200,000 as a gift, then we're going to go to town on that. Like, where's that money come from, and why is he gifting them that money? I'm sure my uncle loves me, but he's not offered to give me £200,000 as a gift to help me with a property. And it can be a sign of other things. It can be a sign of fraud or money laundering or proceeds of crime or any number of things. So we do have to know about them as soon as possible, and then we will take appropriate action. We don't want to go to town. We don't want to be forensic accountants going through everyone's bank statements from 10 years ago, but we have to be satisfied as to where the money's coming from, which we call source of funds, and more importantly these days, the source of wealth. Because if you've got someone who's a 20-something-year-old and he's got a £2 million unencumbered property, for example, then what's the story? Is it the son of a billionaire? Is it someone who's a massive tech entrepreneur, or is it someone who's a drug dealer that has just done something dodgy? So we have to understand source of funds and source of wealth, and the sooner that you can ask those questions, the better. Because if we know that it's something unusual, like the sale of gold or the sale of scrap metal and all these things that we do see quite regularly, then we can look into it and understand it, because we don't want to be scrapping around at the end trying to get that information. So the sooner you can tell us, the better, and then we can take appropriate action. And we'll try and keep it to a minimum, but we will need to do some further checks. Right, I can't see the next one because it's hidden by my video. Right, company structure. So similar to the other point. So I believe that you have, I don't know if it's on all transactions, but I think you fill in with together a company structure chart when applying. So if we can please make sure that's correct and up to date, because we'll often have a bit of a mismatch between what we can see at Companies House and verify, or even what the solicitors tell us, against what is on those documents. So again, more important for offshore companies, but with all transactions, we need to know who are the directors, who are the shareholders. If the shares are held by another company that goes into another company that goes into another company, we have to keep going until we get to a human being at the end of it who we can identify, and we need ID and proof of residence for them. And if you've got anyone who's got a foreign passport, which literally means anyone that's not got a UK passport, then that has to go through enhanced due diligence and compliance checks, both with us and with together. So again, if you know that the borrower has got a Chinese passport, for example, or from any other country, we need to have right to reside, which has to be certified, and we've got to have all of those extra checks done in terms of Dow Jones and politically exposed people and all those things. So if you know that you've got an offshore element, then tell us. I had a broker, not sure if he's on this call, who called me yesterday with a big transaction, a couple of £1 million, and the borrower is South African, living in South Africa with a son who's in London, who's South African but has got a British passport, and they're buying a property together, and they're using various unencumbered properties that, and so we've had a discussion about what we're going to need, and they're already off with collating that before we've even really had the instruction. So yeah, it's just about doing the obvious at the outset, and then that means that we can avoid delays down the line. Okay, third-party charges, and this is something that seems to be cropping up more and more, whether it's we're lending to companies and the property is owned by individuals, or whether we're lending to one individual and the property is owned by multiple people, or we're lending to somebody and mum and dad are offering their property as additional security, and all those sorts of things. So whenever we've got somebody who is not the borrower, we need to get a third-party charge from them. And hopefully that is something that you'll be able to tell us about early on in the process, because it's not that difficult to ask the question, and it just avoids a situation where what we have a lot at the moment is that we'll get the loan agreement, the legal charge prepared by Together using their automated system based on what you're putting in there. But then when the solicitors come back to us, which could be a number of weeks later, we see that the property is actually owned by somebody else, or there's a third person on there, or whatever it may be. And at that point, it's not the biggest drama in the world, but we've got to then go back to Together and say, actually, we need a third party legal charge on this, and they will then prepare that. We've got to then send it to the solicitors. We've got to get it in signed. You've got to, depending on who that person is, they might need independent legal advice. So let's identify who owns the property, or who is going to own the property if it's a purchase, and make sure that we get all the documents right on day one. Okay, and last point, I know this is probably something that I don't need to say to you guys, but it really helps us where we have a broker who is proactive and is chasing, including us. We're happy to be chased, but chasing us, chasing the borrower solicitor, chasing the borrower, chasing the valuer, and just helping us to keep it organized and pull it together. And if you know that the borrower solicitor, for example, has sat on our inquiries for 3 weeks, like, get onto them and either get them a new solicitor, or, you know, kick some ass and get them to pull the finger out, because it's really frustrating when we are really wanting to do transactions at speed and, you know, smash the ball out of the park by turning stuff around, because we get a proper buzz up doing deals in, you know, a day or 2 days or whatever. And it's really frustrating when we write to the borrower's solicitor and then hear nothing for 3 weeks, because that deal could have completed 10 times over in that time. So anything that you can do to help keep on top of everyone, like I say, we're happy if you want to be copied in, as long as we know that you're involved in a deal. We'll copy you into the emails. You know, you can chase whoever you want to chase, and just keep it moving, because that really does help to get those transactions pushed through as quickly as possible.
Lovely. Lots of great tips there, which we will share with everybody who's joined today, so that you've got that list to share with your customers as well. The importance of having some of this information up front. Now, in advance of the webinar, we did ask on the invitation if you had any questions, and we have got a list of a few questions that were asked in advance of the session. But if there's anything else that you can think of, please, just a reminder to use the chat box, and then we will go to the panel afterwards if there are any questions in there afterwards. So the first question that we've had from one of our broker partners, which I'm going to go to Sally on this one, is when is independent legal advice needed?
All right, just unmute myself to talk. Yeah, good question that I'm regularly asked as well, about when's ILA needed. So it's possibly worth also highlighting where you're going to find this information. So Michelle's shared here a screen that there's access to an online chalk resource hub that we've got, where a lot of regularly asked questions and documents have been produced in line with that. And it's also available in packaging guides for Together Commercial Finance and Together Personal Finance about the ILA requirements. So there are certain scenarios where ILA is always needed. And the first one is if a loan amount is over £500,000, or for our homeowner business loan product, which is where you're borrowing on a second charge basis for business purposes against a main residence. The threshold for that is £200,000. Anything above that, we're always going to need ILA. If the individual is providing a third-party charge or a personal guarantee on the loan, regardless of the loan value, we will require ILA. And I know Tim is jumping at the bit because he's going to want to there is a caveat within that about straightforward limited company setups where we may be able to waive the need for ILA. Tim, do you just want to elaborate on that bit?
Yeah, so historically, lenders and their solicitors always used to say, well, if you've got a personal guarantee, you need to have a separate representation. Yeah. And I mean, it's obvious the reasons why they'd want to do that. But when you actually think about it, if you've got, which we often see, a limited company that's got a sole director and a sole shareholder, our view and Together's view is that that person cannot have a conflict with themselves. And therefore, we would be happy for one solicitor to be advising the borrower, i.e. the company, as well as that guarantor, because it would just be bonkers if we started sending them down the road where someone's going to charge them £250 or £500 to do an independent advice because they're guaranteeing their own loan. So if you've got a sole director, sole shareholder, then we wouldn't require ILA in relation to the personal guarantee.
Thanks. Another one is where the underwriter deems there to be a non-standard risk, and the kind of application that would fall within is like a parent-child application, or if we were lending to a separated couple, something like that. And then there's a couple. So where there's a risk that an individual party to the loan is not receiving an obvious benefit. So that might be if you were doing debt consolidation, but most of the debts are in one party's name, or where part of the loan is for business purposes, but both applicants aren't related to the business. So it might only be that one of the clients is the business holder. And the reason that we ask for ILA in those circumstances is that it protects us from a scenario where they both sign loan agreements, but later down the line, one party declares that they were unaware of what they were getting into in the first place. So the ILA just gives the protection around that. We always require it for non-English speaking individuals. If a power of attorney is used, then you would need ILA. And any individual that is identified as vulnerable. And so within that same ilk, we always have for clients that are over the age of 70. And the reason that we've placed the age of 70 on that is that we deem age 70 to be a standard retirement age. If you lend into a customer in retirement, it increases the risk that we'd be repossessing a property, the client that would be considered vulnerable, or using pension income to support that loan application and the implications of that. And then there's also just one additional caveat that it may just be kind of any other unique or specific item relating to that case that the underwriter deems it necessary, because together we take this common sense approach in the way that we assess lending and assess each case on an individual merit basis. But there might then be a scenario where the underwriter is happy to proceed, but just want to get the client to get independent legal advice to give us that extra protection.
Fabulous, thank you. So now I'm going to Barry. Next question. If a lease needs to be extended, but the freeholder is absent, what is the solution, or is there a solution to allow completion?
Well, it's not something that we would do in together as part of the internal team, but to my knowledge, the court is ultimately the solution to these things. Quite often we do get cases where they may come in and people will say a freeholder's absent, or we'll not be able to contact them, etc. But really all they've done is made a phone call, or they've got a receipt from 6 months ago, and not really made really detailed inquiries. So what I'd always say is make sure there's been extensive searches made to try to locate your freeholder, whoever they may be. If they're a company, obviously you've got Companies House to go to. If it's an individual, maybe a little bit more difficult, but you may have old invoices and that sort of correspondence with them going back a few years. But ultimately, if you can't get a contact and there's no response coming back to anything that's sent to the old addresses or telephone numbers, emails, whatever it might be, then to my knowledge, the courts are the only place where you would be able to approach to enable your lease to be extended in the absence of a freeholder being responsive. Now, the courts would want to see that you've made those extensive investigations before you go to them. So again, do as much as you can before you go in that direction, because it can be costly and it can take a while. But to my knowledge, that's ultimately the path to take. Now, Tim's got a far more extensive litigation background than me, so he may have come across it, and similarly David. So I'd be glad to pass over if they can add anything further.
Yeah, but completely agree with everything that Barry said there. He's right. The only option, if they are generally missing, is to go to the court. it would be very rare for us to get involved in a transaction like that. And normally what we would be looking to do is, subject to the values, is to lend on the lease that is there at the time. So together we'll look to lend on relatively short leases, and Sally's probably the best place to comment on that. But we do see short leases, and as long as they're valued very carefully on the basis of that, and all of this is factored in, it's very rare that it would have to be extended. What's more common is when someone comes to us and we are helping fund that lease extension. But obviously, if we're doing that, we know who the leaseholder is, so that's not really relevant. I think, again, this falls into the category of pick up the phone to us, to the underwriter, have a chat about it. What would together be prepared to lend on it as it is. Absent landlords are not necessarily an issue in their own right. I appreciate it's not quite the question that was asked, but absent landlords are different to an absent landlord with a lease that also needs extending. So we can get indemnity policies and do various things when we've just got a missing landlord. But the question about how do you do a lease extension, that's something that the borrower would most likely, like Barry said, go with their solicitor, sort that out. If they really wanted that to be done before they borrow the money to maximize the loan, then that's something that they would do, hopefully long before it came to any of us.
Lovely, thank you. And I'm just going to stay on you, Tim. What can be done via Zoom versus what is actually needed to be done face to face?
Okay, so back in the day when I first started out, we used to make the borrowers go physically to their solicitor, see them, have their ID certified, and the solicitor would always be the witness, and those were the rules. And then a little thing called COVID came along, and we'd always make exceptions, but COVID came along, and it was like, well, do you want to do no business, or do you want to change the rules? And so, surprise, surprise, we changed the rules. We dropped the requirement for borrower solicitors to physically meet with them, and the Zoom Teams generation started, and we do require a video call of some description where the borrower's solicitor can say that they've advised them and they can vouch for that's the right person that they know from the ID or from other transactions, and see them signing the documents ideally. But they can't be the witness on those documents. So they would have to be a physical witness, an independent adult preferably, who would be the witness on those documents. And again, going back to the quality of solicitors, we get solicitors even now who we have to argue with to explain to them why they cannot witness a document over a video call, which quite simply there just isn't a mechanism in English law to do that. Law of Property at 1925, you've got to be in the room when you're witnessing. And the amount of times that we have to explain that to solicitors is quite shocking. But we will now allow on all transactions, whether it's ILA on PG, whether it's the advice to the borrower, whether it's advice to a third-party charge, even statutory declarations can be done on video calls now. We will always allow that. I suppose the only time where we would ever need something to be done face-to-face, given that that's sort of what's being asked, is if there's something very unusual. So if we've got like an elderly, like a very elderly person who is borrowing the money or being some sort of guarantor or something like that, or if we've got concerns about their mental capacity, or if we just, for example, we just have a bit of a spidey sense that something's wrong, then we might say to them, no, we want you to go and see that person to go and make sure that everything's above board and there's no duress or whatever. So yeah, we like to think that we've made it a lot smoother. COVID wasn't great, but it did have some positives, and one of those is that we all just got a bit smarter and more techie, and it helps. But remember, those original documents still do have to be with the borrower's solicitor. So even if they're being signed remotely, let's make sure they get in the post in some sort of track delivery method and go there. We still see a lot of solicitors meeting with their clients in person. It may be that's something they want to do, particularly if they don't know the borrower. But as far as Together is concerned, it's not a requirement on all but the most extreme cases.
Lovely. Thank you, Tim. Barry, I'm just going to come to you because Tim had mentioned indemnity policies just a moment earlier. Can you give us a couple of examples of where Together have accepted indemnity policies to allow cases to complete quicker?
Yeah, we do occasionally get these proposed to us by by the brokers or occasionally the customers' lawyers. suppose the more common categories we see are the undervalue, the gifts and that sort of scenario, which is probably the most common we see. Flying freehold policies crop up from time to time. We also see them for lack of easements, for rights away, that sort of thing. There are a kind of a plethora of these things, absent landlord, as Tim's mentioned. But they need to just fit the particular circumstances of the case. We have our own title insurance, which is on all the loans we do, but it will only cover certain scenarios, and it certainly won't cover for anything that's already happened. These are only things to cover a potential risk of something that might happen moving forward. So the difficulty we get is that we're sat back from the borrower and maybe the lawyer or the representative as to what's going on in the background. The brokers and the introducers they're all the eyes and ears out there with these people in the field. So the more information they can give to whoever's going to be providing the policy and the reasons for it, then hopefully those policies will align to the case in hand, and we'll be able to accept them, because it will be a condition we would place on the lawyer acting or whoever was providing it, that the conditions that the insurer is putting down are all met and fully complied with by the completion date.
Thank you for that, Barry. So next question, we've probably only got time for one more. I do want to quickly answer. Harriet has popped on the chat about full valuations. How long are they valid for? With ourselves, we do require a rely upon after 3 months. And once it gets to the 6-month stage, a new valuation is required. But I'm just going to plug our previous webinar that we did with Stephen Todd from VAS, where he goes into a lot of detail around valuations, things to look out for, and the reason why the 3-month rule it is in place with ourselves. So it's worth having a look at that, Harriet, when you get a chance, and anybody else who hasn't seen it on the call. So just last question, and then other questions that we received I will follow up via email. So this is to David and Tim, because I'd like to get a view from both an England and Wales and then a Scotland perspective. So David, first to you, what is the potential impact of an unadopted road being the only access to a property in Scotland?
So if you don't have an adopted road, you've got to make sure that the property has a properly constituted certiorari right of access. So I say it's a private road just going to that one unique property. That's what you'd be looking for. You want to make sure that it's got a written, registered certiorari right of access to access the road. If it didn't, then you'd be relying on prescription. So if they've accessed the road for over 20 years, then that will resolve itself by prescription. That's a 20-year prescription. So normally what you do for that is you get an affidavit to confirm that it has been used uninterrupted for 20 years, and you'd probably take a title policy just as a top-up for that. If you're talking about an unadopted road in a development, which you still get here occasionally, so sometimes for whatever reason when development's finished, a road within a development is not adopted, then all you've got to do is again make sure that the property has the rights of access, or there's a right of common ownership of this road so they can access the house in the development. But you also want to make sure who's responsible for maintaining that road within the development, because obviously that's important. You want to make sure there's equal maintenance cost of that road. But those are the issues that you've actually got with an unadopted road.
Thank you, David. Anything different in England and Wales, Tim?
It's actually very similar. I think the key thing is we're looking, like David said, is there a formal right of way? Because there's not an issue with the road being unadopted. The issue is with there not being a right of way. So particularly in sort of agricultural settings, you'll often find that the properties are mile down an unadopted track or whatever. That's fine, as long as we can see from the title documents that it has a right of way over that, and it all adds up. Obviously, we're still looking, like David said, about maintenance obligations and costs and things like that, and being alive to the fact that we might have to contribute a percentage of the cost, and that can affect value and things. But the bigger issue arises where you've got an unadopted road with no access rights. And that does happen. And that's when you're into the realms of getting indemnity policies, but also maybe getting, if it's a purchase, a statutory declaration from the owner of the property to say that they, you know, they've lived there for 15 years and never had a problem with access and whatever. So, and again, if it might be a remortgage where someone's owned the property for 30 years, but it's not got a right of way and it's not an adopted road. And we, again, be getting a policy supported by a stat dec. So the beauty of working with Together is that they will be genuinely very commercial with these sorts of things. So they will say to us, look, you know, can you protect against it? Can we do it? And we will do that. A lot of lenders out there will say, well, we're just not going to lend on something that's not got a right of way because we don't want to rely on a sort of, you know, £100 access policy or whatever. But we will do that, and we'll be very pragmatic and commercial. And again, it's one of those things that can come out in the legal process, and we sort it and we try and work around it as best we can.